Polymer clay can do so much more than make jewelry. In this video, we're going to use supplies from the Floral Garden Create-Along box to make a tool organizer or a holder for anything. Hey there, Sandy Huntress here for Create-Along. So I am always looking for alternate ways of using things. And when I got the Floral Garden box and came across this coaster slash ornament set or frame, I immediately thought of what if we were to lift this up, put a cylinder in between the two, then you would have a holder, a tool organizer or a brush holder or whatever you want. You just need something in between, some kind of cylinder, and what I have here is a potato chip container, like a Pringles container. This is just a shorty. You need something that's a little bit smaller than the diameter of the flower, so that can go on there. And it can be up to as small as this opening. Just so we have a nice professional finish, I'm going to take some black acrylic paint and paint these both with a couple thin coats on both sides. So this one has 2 coats on it, and you'll see I did something a little different here. I added in some of the mica powders that came in the Floral Garden set, just to give it a little bit of shimmer. And the way you do that is add your second thin coat of paint. And you know, long ago when I learned to paint, I remember reading directions that said 2 thin coats is better than, or several thin coats is better than 1 thick one. And I was always so impatient and said, the heck with that. You know, 1 thick coat's faster. But I've learned they were right. It does look a lot nicer. You don't get as many brush strokes. You just get a nicer finish. Now, if you want to add the mica powders, you want to have them ready to add after you've added the second thin coat, right afterwards, while the paint is still tacky. If you've added it nice and thin, it won't stay tacky for long. And because only the outer petals of this one are going to show, that's all I'll do. I'm going to dip my brush in here. We won't get paint in here unless you like mix it around, but you can just dip your brush to pick up some of the mica and then brush it on. And that's it. Just leaves this really pretty kind of flower petal streaks and a shimmer. And if you work it too much, see, it just disappears. So you just put it on and give a couple strokes. And because the paint is still a little tacky, it sticks. So it's just kind of a fun, different effect than just flat acrylic paint. And it will make it go with our polymer clay piece. I am also going to paint the silver edges of my can with black acrylic paint, just so that it blends in better, because I'm going to use black polymer clay. These pieces are all dry, so we will set these aside for a minute, and we just need this for some measurements. Grab yourself a tape measure and measure the circumference of your piece. Mine is about 9 1/4 inches, so that tells me the width I need to cut my strip. And then the height is 3 1/8 inches. And I'm measuring between these little metal pieces on the can, because that will just make it really easy to put a piece of clay right in there. Then you'll cut a strip of polymer clay to that size. Mine I cut 9 1/2, just a little big because it's easier to trim some off the end to make it meet neatly, and exactly 3 1/8 inches. I have a tip for you. If you do a lot of polymer clay work of this sort, I highly recommend one of these quilter's rulers. I love these. I have these as a quilter. They are fantastic for polymer clay because they have all these lines and you can line up things precisely. To decorate our clay, I'm going to use the Scandinavian floral silkscreen that came in the Floral Garden box. I just love the whimsy of these designs. I'm also going to use the Floral Garden pigment set that came in the box, and I love this little tray that they all pop into. It makes it so easy and keeps them all in order. This is where I did a bunch of experimenting. I tried several different ways of playing with these pigments and the silkscreen to get an interesting look. So on this one, these were all done on black polymer clay, by the way. This one, first I silkscreened this with gold paint, and then I went over the whole thing, just putting these colors in various areas, and then buffed it. Now, I don't know how well you can see on camera. Maybe you can see there. But the buffing really took down the texture of the paint. On this other side, I did the mica powders first. Put them on all over, buffed it smooth, then added the silk screening with the acrylic paint, and you can see the texture of the paint is still there, and the design of the paint is much more bold if you compare the two. I just did one on each side to save clay. So in this case, I thought maybe the gold was a little too subtle. I wasn't sure. I thought maybe I wanted a more bold representation of the flowers. On this one, I did the micas first, then stenciled over with some ivory acrylic paint. Now this one illustrates a couple mistakes that I made. First of all, my paint was a little too thin for this application because when you add the mica powders first, it keeps the silkscreen from sticking quite as well to the polymer, so some of it seeped under on the top here. Also, I rolled my clay way too thin. I think I had it at nearly the thinnest setting here. I wasn't thinking, obviously. And it's really hard to manage. For all the other sheets, I rolled it on a number 3 on my Atlas, which is about just under 2 millimeters, and that's a good thickness. So here's the look with the silk screening on top of the mica powders. And here's the look with the silk screening first, then the mica powders on top. You can really tell with the lighter paint that the micas actually stain the paint a little bit. They do not come off completely. And here's an illustration of another mistake I made, which was rubbing a little too hard to try to get the color off of the paint, and I ended up removing the paint altogether. Although you can kind of see underneath, it makes a ghost image, which is a resist, which you could play with that. I don't know how well you can see this final sample. This was one that I did the acrylic paint first, this time in black, and you can barely see the design. I did the mica powders over it and buffed it, and it is way subtle. So on this one, I did the mica powders first and then did the black. There you go. It almost looks like velvet. The tricky part with this is just in the silkscreen over the mica powders where the silkscreen doesn't stick too well. But we can get past that. Now, of course, your silkscreen isn't wide enough to go across this entire band, so you'll have to do a couple silk screenings. So what I suggest you do, first of all, it goes blue side down. And you can burnish it. And then silkscreen with your choice of color of paint. And here it is with gold paint. I'm showing you with gold paint on the black clay just so you can see it, because black on black is kind of tough on camera. But how do you line up and get as neat a possible an edge as you can? Well, this is my trick, is first of all, do your silk screening in the middle. Then you only have to wait for one section to dry before you can do the other 2 sections. Secondly, grab yourself a straight edge and an extra fine Sharpie and draw lines on your tile. So line up your straight edge right with the edge of your paint and then draw marks right on your tile. And do the same on your silkscreen. These silk screens do not line up from edge to edge. They're not like wallpaper where if you find the right spot, they will line up. They won't. So you'll just have to kind of look and decide where is a good place that would make that join kind of unobtrusive. Then you line up your registration marks. Burnish it down. And now you can silk screen. I definitely need a little more paint there. All right, let's see how I did. Not bad. And then I can move over and do the other side too. Of course, it goes without saying you should wait until your paint is completely dry before you start adding the micas. And this, by the way, is another reason for doing all those tests that I did. Like, this color does not excite me in the least, but I really like the way it looks on the black clay. So doing a few tests will show that to you. Now, I tried different ways of adding these to my sheet, and I found the final look I liked best was when I added these in dabs. These are just little applicators that came in a previous Create-Along box. This one is actually a nicer color once it's on the sheets. And for example, this green, you might be able to see it in certain light. It kind of looks green. And in others it looks gold. In the final piece, it actually reads as more of a gold than a green. So you don't, only in certain angles do you actually see that dark green. So doing a few tests will help you get more of the results you want. So I am just going to continue until this entire sheet is covered with little dots of mica powder. The yellow is very strong, so you might want to be sparing with that, or it will come out really yellow looking. Now that I've got all of my powders added, I'm going to take a dry towel and hold it over a trash can and just gently brush off all of the excess that I can brush off. I'll show you a little bit here. You can see how doing that blends the colors, but because we pounced it on, we still have those small dots or areas of color. Now you can see how that looks with most of the excess removed. I'm just going to take another towel and some water and buff it gently. Remember my mistake earlier in removing my paint, so just be gentle when you do this. And you want to change areas once your towel has picked up a lot of the micas. And there. Doing it in this order, with the silk screening first, then the micas over top, definitely gives you a far more subtle look than if you do the micas first and then silk screen over top, because you can see even in the gold, the colors do stain the silk screening. Here's a sheet I've done with the micas first before doing the silk screening. I'm just finishing up burnishing it with a damp cloth. This removes the excess micas and kind of brings out that texture that you got from pouncing on the colors. Once again, I have my silk screen blue side down, and the only difference between silk screening on top of the micas and silk screening straight on the clay is that you want to burnish really well before you apply the paint, and you don't want to use a paint that has too thin a viscosity. And do your best to apply enough paint to start so you don't have to go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth over it. It's best if you can get it in 1 or 2 swipes. Rats. I may wash that off and try again. I probably just didn't burnish that top bit enough. Here I am back. I literally took this whole thing, tile and all, up to the sink and just ran it under running water and gently rubbed off the paint. I don't know if you can see it on camera. It's very subtle, but there actually is a tiny ghost of the silkscreen design, but it's so faint I'm not going to worry about it. One thing I forgot to mention is before you silkscreen, it's a good idea to take some paper like a deli paper or parchment paper and burnish. And you can do this before you add the silkscreen to the plain black clay too. Just burnish it down to the tile, pushing out any air bubbles and getting the whole surface smooth. You'll just have a nicer finish in the end. And in the case of silkscreening on the micas, this is my third time around, and you can see a little bit of the mica has come up on the paper, which is only going to make my silk screening job easier. The more excess I can remove, the better the clay, or the better the silk screen will stick to the clay. So let's try again. This time I'm going to be a little more careful and make sure I really burnish the whole thing well. Oh, let's see. Oh, much better. There. So I'll let this dry, then add my registration marks and silkscreen the other two sides. At this point, once your paint is all dry, your markers are applied, and you're happy with it, you might want to recheck your measurements. I think mine has grown just a smidge over 3 1/8, just from all the burnishing. So I am going to do a tiny bit of trimming, because it will definitely make life easier if it is exactly the right size, the right height anyways. So now we can cover our tube with this. When you're lifting up a piece of clay like this, be patient, take your time. The blade is at 45, maybe a little bit more shallow angle, and you just saw back and forth, pressing the blade to the tile. That way you don't accidentally gouge your piece, and you should be able to lift it up. Here's my canister again, and I am going to cover this with a thin coat of liquid clay. This helps the clay stick during baking, although it would probably stick fine to the cardboard. Not as well as to glass or something. But most importantly, adding this will help prevent air bubbles, because the clay will stick to the liquid clay. And air bubbles would be unsightly in a project like this. Now I have my liquid clay on. On the chance that your can maybe has an area that's dinged or doesn't look quite as nice as the rest, find a nice area to be your front. And then I am going to apply this starting at the middle. And just looks like maybe I trimmed off too much. Don't care, that part's going to be underneath and it's painted. And I'm just gonna take a moment and smooth so we don't have air bubbles, because that would look worse than this rim up here showing having air bubbles. Okay, and I'm pressing there so I can see where I need to trim, and I'm actually gonna do this like you would when you were wrapping a cane. Open it out, I can see that line. Cut right on that line. Oh, I even used the sharp end. Put that back and it should meet perfectly. Oh, nice. Grab a piece of paper and just kind of burnish that seam. Do that until it looks nice and you're happy with it, and then bake this whole thing. Because this is such a thin layer of clay, you don't really need to bake it for long. I would do half an hour at the manufacturer's recommended temperature. And once that's baked, you can grab some E6000, glue your base on, add some glue to the underside of the top piece and glue that on. And isn't that just the cutest thing? A great place to store anything, and you could customize it for someone as a really cute gift. maybe with some makeup brushes for a girl for a birthday. Once again, this is Sandy Huntress for Create Along, wishing you happy creating.